this part out, but for the live audience, it's good not to say anything too dramatic.
Yeah, I haven't had to use my bleep function so far, and we've been doing this for 7 months, so I think we should be safe here. I do have a
no,
button.
Rebecca, we could try to be the first.
There you go. Hey.
There,
That's
the
a
Brookings team throws back the gauntlet.
Love it, love it, love it.
Sorry.
All right,
Punya
I'm gonna
puts
go-
together the video when we're done. And
Oh, good.
Yeah,
Punya does great.
So I will hop off onto the YouTube channel. Have a great hour, and we'll see you at the back end.
And
Great.
Punya also does the
Take
wonderful
care,
graphics.
enjoy it, and make sure, Chris, you introduce next week's episode. Okay,
Yes,
that's
I
about
will.
our own
Have a
reflection.
good one, guys.
Bye, guys. Enjoy.
Thanks,
You
Punya.
too.
Thanks.
see you.
Absolutely.
So it's great to have you with us. And if you have any, do you have an email for them, Chris, so we can send them the follow-up video?
Yeah,
Yes.
definitely. So I'll begin and just basically in a couple sentences introduce the two of you, introduce Kurt and Song-Ye, and then I'm going to ask Rebecca to say more about herself and about her work. After that, we'll take a question or two, 5-6 minutes, and then we'll take a question or two. And then Jenny, I'll ask you to do the same, and 5-6 minutes, and we'll take a question or two. And then all hell breaks loose after that. We just
It's a free
throw it
for all.
open, and whatever happens, happens.
Say,
Kurt gets a
introduce us.
gleam in his eye, and who knows what's going to happen next.
Well, Chris, when you say you'll turn to me and say, introduce yourself, tell you about your work, is that the part where you're saying, talk about the Beyond Reopening piece, or is it just general who you are?
No, it's talk about the
Okay.
reopening piece. So they have the site on which you've got your detailed biography.
Right.
So I think
Okay.
you can just add anything
Launch
that
in.
you want that
Okay.
reflects what you're currently doing. Scott, thank you for joining us.
Hey, Scott.
Hi, Scott.
Scott keeps us honest because he's the one that isn't in educational technology. So they have the site on which you've got your detail. Oh, somebody has their, we're getting an echo because somebody has their, there we go. Scott, you got anything you want to say before? You're muted.
Muted.
Yep. Only that we're appreciative that you're with us. Thank you.
I was going to
always,
say that while Scott is not an educational technologist, he's the most technology savvy of the 5 or 6 of us. So until he muted his mic, I was going to say that.
We should always give a shout out to Song-Ye for joining us, given her time in the morning.
Yes, it's very early for you.
Scott, we miss you.
Yeah, we're glad you're back.
Yeah, sorry I missed last week. So totally forgot to let y'all know.
So will you be on the back channel with Punya and?
I think I'm a host this time, so you're stuck with me.
Are you? Okay. We'll have 3 co-hosts.
Yep.
Sounds good.
And Scott, you might want to volunteer for the other one Chris is putting together about AR and VR, because that's up your alley. I'm just giving you a nudge there, Scott.
Yeah, sure, whatever. It's all good.
All right, we're going to start in about 30 seconds.
Okay.
So we just saw Scott raise his hand, Chris, just so you got a co-host for the episode you have coming up.
Yes, we have a video record of this, so.
And Jenny and
definitely
Rebecca,
committed.
I prepare principals and superintendents. I'm an educational leadership professor. So I have technology orientations, which is why Young invited me, but have a slightly different lens than these instructional folks.
So it's time to start. I'm Chris Deedy. I teach leadership technology and policy at Harvard University. I'm one of the co-hosts and co-founders of the initiative. And we're very excited tonight to feature the great work of the Brookings Institution with Rebecca Winthrop and Jenny Perlman Robinson as our guest experts, and Kurt and Songye and Scott as our co-hosts, and Yang and Punya managing the lively YouTube chat in the background. So we'll begin by asking Rebecca to talk a little bit more about herself and then about the current work at Brookings that relates to the theme of the show, which is that there's a silver lining in this terrible pandemic that we're in.
Is that my cue, Chris?
That's your cue.
Okay. Hi. Thanks, Chris, for having and the whole team for having us. So for the folks who are joining us and don't know, my colleague Jenny and I are from the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution. We are a nonpartisan, I repeat this every single presentation I do, nonpartisan think tank based in Washington, D.C., but we've got team members from 25 countries around the world. So some of the thinking that we've been doing for the last several years is around how to harness innovation, whether it be technology or not technology, to leapfrog educational progress. And for that, we really mean just accelerate the pace of change with an end goal in whole child development, basically, or academic plus 21st century skills, or whatever you want to call it, sort of future ready education systems. And COVID, to me, has reflected many things very difficult, such as widening inequality and really strip bare the deep inequities within our societies that schools help address, even though schools aren't perfect. They're far from perfect, but they we certainly miss them when they're gone in a blink of an eye. So that's really important to note. And I think actually for us is a silver lining, because we've been thinking about several things around this moment and arguing very much that it is, if there's ever a moment to leapfrog in education globally, this is it. I cannot imagine that we will ever find another moment, at least knock on wood, in decades to come, that would give us such an opportunity. And my colleagues and I, with my co-director Emiliana Vegas and Jenny and many other people around the team, put our heads together and we put out a piece in September on the margins of the UN General Assembly, which highlighted 4 kind of themes, one which I already stated, which is it's a leapfrog moment, but the two, and inequalities rising, but the two that I think are really important to note is that I think there's a real political moment, because it's rare that the parents and families and communities who don't have school, who so highly demand school day in and day out pre-COVID, those, whether they're in refugee camps and rural parts of sub-Saharan Africa, wherever they may be, have common cause with middle class parents across the world around how important it is and how much they really, really want to send their kids to school. One, they get them out of the house. Schools have a huge pastoralist custodial role in our societies in terms of child welfare, child care, enabling the economy to continue because parents can work outside the home. So it's not what we go to get our PhDs for in education schools, but it is a really important role that schools serve. And I think there's a political moment, and I always think politics is something that the education community, not politics with a capital P, but the political economy of change, is something that the education community doesn't pay enough attention to. So that's one thing we wanted to highlight. And the second thing that I think the moment highlights in terms of trends or opportunities is that I feel like as we scanned the globe and we asked people, there's a lot of things that is happening in education that people don't want to continue. families want to send their kids back to school. Teachers want to be able to be face-to-face with their students. But we asked with our network, what are new ways that you're tackling education that you want to continue after COVID? And what we found was it was all to do with this sort of emergence of educational allies outside the school building. And I think that's a real opportunity. This idea of a local learning ecosystem, which Valerie Hannon and many others in our Leapfrog framework, we talk a lot about diversifying people and places. The in and out, as Chris talks about life-wide learning, the in and out of school sort of fabric of children's experiences to really leverage them for building their capacities. If we can keep those allies that have emerged outside the school walls after COVID is done in a really complementary way, that could really be a game changer. And I'll give one example of that, and then I'll stop, because I'm sure you'll have other things to ask Chris, or other people will. One of the examples that came up most strongly when we did a sort of light canvassing of our network was parent engagement. And using very low tech ways, smartphones, phone calls. There's great examples from Botswana, great examples from India. We got great examples from the United States, great examples from Argentina. We have a bunch of examples. I think we only put Botswana and India in the paper, but of basically government all of a sudden really reaching out to parents. And in India, Himachal Pradesh is a state in India that the government started doing electronic parent-teacher meetings, sending SMS messages, WhatsApp messages with little problems. In Botswana, they would do something similar and then call the parents and say, please put your kid on speaker, and they would talk through the problem. And in Botswana, it was amazing. Kids' learning increased. It actually helped. So, that's not to replace schools, but it certainly would be a strong complement. And in many ways, the feedback we got was that the people in the education community were very surprised at how engaged parents were, particularly parents who had very little education themselves, very little literacy capacity, and who in the past ways of engaging parents hadn't been very active. And so to me, it just shows how if you flip your paradigm on how you try to bring parents in as allies, as complements, and do it in a totally different way, then you might get a lot more bang for your buck. So
as I listen to this, it brings a couple thoughts to mind. One of them is that, as you know, there's a lot of deficit models that are applied to populations who've been marginalized. And part of those deficit models is, well, these people just don't really care about education. That's part of why they're marginalized. But nothing could be further from the truth. And this is helping to reveal that. The other is, as you know, that culturally relevant education depends on the participation of the local community, because they're the ones who really most deeply understand the culture. And so this is, again, opening some interesting doors. Kurt, do you have questions, thoughts?
First of all, you guys sleeping during the pandemic, I must say you're probably being called on call all the time from all around the world. Your colleagues are probably worried about your health. None of us are sleeping much during the past 6 months. I just can't imagine all the work you probably are churning out right now. Among them, I want to alert our listeners, our viewers, to the reports that they've got. You might take a look at some of them. Very short and very readable. You can get a model on scaling if you go to this, and maybe they'll talk about that. But they have two short reports, one from March, the COVID-19 Crisis and Reflections on Systems Transformation. It has 4 or 5 principles. March 26, you have 4 principles: iterative adaptive learning, engagement of multiple actors, knowledge sharing and peer-to-peer learning, and innovation in education. and including the first line is there's a silver lining in this crisis, which aligns with this show. The second report talks about emerging findings from scaling. So a lot about scaling all the projects. The 5 things there are leading with a problem, not a preconceived solution, which I've just recently written about myself. I'll send you that article. Moving from project mentality to systems mindset, establishing a winning coalition, strengthening adaptive capacity, and creating a learning community. In particular, I want to end with the last one, creating a learning community. Can you talk about that a bit, what you're doing to, and what you envision other people could do to create a learning community? Or would you like to talk about any of the other findings or principles? And is there a principle not in the report that's come up since then that you wish you would have put in the report? So I'll scatter a few different things at you, Jenny and Rebecca, and we'll see if you got something.
Over to you, Jenny.
Sure, great. Well, thanks, Kurt and Shanye and Scott and Chris. It's a pleasure to be here. And you know, just to say, you're right, Kurt, we wrote that piece back in March, and we certainly did not want to diminish or downplay in any way the tremendous suffering and impact that COVID is having. Certainly that it's currently having in people's lives and in education systems around the world, and the potentially devastating impact it could have, right, for years to come. But I think, you know, similar to, as I understand the idea behind this podcast series, you know, as Rebecca was speaking to, if ever there was a moment to think about deep change that's needed in a system, frankly, that's not known for perhaps being so nimble and flexible and quick to change, this might be our moment. And so really, I think, you know, as Rebecca was speaking to, a lot of deep thinking among our team about thinking about identifying those innovations, thinking about what type of adaptations need to happen given the variety of context and children that need to be reached. And then finally, the work that you're speaking about, Kurt, which is, and then what do we do to make sure that they're actually scaling? And by that, we mean that we move beyond sort of small scale effective innovations or islands of excellence, if you would, and really think about, you know, expanding and deepening impact. So it's addressing, you know, the magnitude of the learning crisis that we certainly faced pre-COVID and that we all know has only been exacerbated by COVID. And so, you know, what was interesting in some ways is that you listed those principles, Kurt, that we had identified, and maybe I'll say a few words about how we identified them. But then COVID struck, and we realized that those principles that you listed really became all the more important in trying to navigate in the sort of rapidly evolving and changing world we were all living through. So just to say where some of those findings came from. So I work with a team that's focused on this question of scale and larger systems change and transformation. And previously, Rebecca and myself and one of Chris's students and colleagues, Eileen McGivney, put out a report called Millions Learning. And in some ways, I think it was somewhat akin, again, to, as I understand Silver Linings looking to do, is to say, okay, where can we take inspiration from what's possible? And what is it that we can learn from that and build on and further? And so that was really the idea behind Millions Learning. Where can we identify where there's been large scale progress in children's learning, both in access, you know, getting into school, but certainly also learning valuable skills? And what are some of the patterns or drivers or factors that seem to be common across a variety of different cases and different contexts that, you know, we could further build upon? And so that became this Millions Learning report. Fast forward to the work we're doing now, where we're currently in the process of accompanying a number of innovations that they themselves are scaling. So scaling around the world, whether it's in primary school and secondary school, teacher professional development, life skills education, financial education, wide variety in sub-Saharan Africa, in the Middle East, and so forth. And really, again, with the idea to say, okay, what is it that we can learn about the scaling process? At the same time, how can we best support it? So really employing a learning by doing approach. So we're really rolling up our sleeves, both as researchers and implementers and policymakers and funders, and learning together. And then finally, how can we document this so that others, again, can build on and learn from this, both what's working well and frankly, what's not working well, so we can further that. And so that's really where these principles that you point to emerged from these different cases from around the world that I'm happy to speak more to.
I found that Lily's learning report, and I sent a note to everyone, and Chris says, "Oh, I know those people." So that's how this all got started, through that report. I stumbled upon one day. I don't know what I was looking for, but it really excited me. So I'm really glad that you were able to come in and talk about it.
Xiangye, do you have some points you want to make?
Yes, I have some actually not comments, but the kind of my curiosity and my own questions rising from the comparing with China, that we have mentioned in our previous episodes, that China now is the first country to fully, almost completely getting out of this pandemic, and everything is almost getting to normal. However, compared with our optimistic projection of this silver lining brought by the pandemic that might bring the schools some huge innovation opportunities, or even this kind of leapfrogging opportunities. But in reality, at least China case is teaching me that everything is back to normal, and almost everything is back to the old normal of the schooling. So have you ever considered or imagined what could be the barriers ahead of your imagination, and what can we do in other situations, and then we can learn. Thank you.
I think it's a really good point, and it's something that I think Jenny and I both think about a lot before COVID, which is the enabling environment. The enabling environment for change, and some of the thing that a couple of things that I think COVID has taught us, which is, I think, Xiangye, what you were saying, in not so many words, was that education systems can change. Like colleagues, one of Chris's Harvard colleagues, Fernando Reimers and Andreas Schleicher, they have this great line in some of their reports saying, it's showed us the latent innovative capacity of education systems. But the issue there, for example, we have a whole network of, we have about 16 jurisdictions, largely school districts or provinces or states within countries, that we're working on at the moment around parent engagement strategies, coming out of COVID, and how to do a better job, and how to harness parent demand, which is, I think, one of the levers for enabling environment. And there's a wonderful team from South Africa, and they were saying, look, one of the reasons why in our latest meeting there was so much innovation is the tolerance for risk was totally through the roof, meaning nobody knew what to do. So you just tried stuff. So the bureaucratic streamlining of new approaches. If you were a teacher and you couldn't figure out how to they had great examples of teachers trying to get school supplies to kids who had no connectivity, couldn't do the remote learning, and they, would use little supermarket chains, and like you drop the school supplies there, text the families would come and get the school supplies and books and stuff so the kids can continue learning. And the teacher didn't have to, fill out a form and send it up to the principal and get it stamped and wait for approval. She just did it, right? Maybe she told her headmaster and said, this is what I'm going to do. So I think we probably don't want an enabling environment, which is everybody do whatever the heck they can do. That's probably a little too chaotic. I'm looking to Scott and wondering what his views are here, given his expertise. But I think one of the things we need to think a lot about is the enabling environment for innovation. Like, what is it? And, what is it that enables such great innovative ideas to flourish? Exactly. And how could we keep the helpful part of that without a mega crisis? Like we shouldn't have to have a pandemic to unleash teachers' innovative capacity, right? That doesn't seem right. So that's one. The other thing that I've been thinking a lot about, and there was a question I see from Gerald, I think, which is basically about, he was asking about sort of the elite in any middle class or elite in any given country, are they blocking change? And I think there's a lot of evidence. Some of our colleagues do a lot of work on opportunity hoarding, which can be in education or can be in anything, but it's basically when you study social mobility, people who sort of climb the ladder and get to where they are, they've figured out the way to advance in society, and then they hold on to those tricks for themselves and don't let anybody else. And that in the United States, for example, can be around school financing, et cetera. All sorts of strategies that people probably not even intentionally, it's just motivated out of pure, I want to keep this for my kid and my family. They're not trying to be sort of hoggy people. I think individually they're probably very nice, and I'm probably part of the group of middle-class parents who advocate for your kid without realizing sort of the inequities. So I think opportunity hoarding is something we have to keep a big eye on. And there, I think it's probably our best anecdote is to get really, I think government intervention. Like, I think if anything, I'm coming out of this whole thing much more strongly on the side of government, not the government that gets bad rap, like all the bureaucratic red tape and the teachers can't innovate, but I'm coming out on the side of public schools and really strong setting strong enabling environments and regulation for people to deliver and do different things, but really looking at equity and trying to counter opportunity hoarding through policy. So that's a second thing. And the third thing that I think about, Xiangye, based on your question, and it's part of why we wrote that piece, Beyond Reopening Schools, How Can Education Emerge Stronger than before COVID, is because I think there is actually an important role in setting out a vision, because most people, I feel you're totally right, Kurt. I feel like we got on the treadmill in February of Brookings when China, our team members in China reached out and said, how do we train on, do online remote teacher training? And like, we've been on the treadmill ever since, and it's for us slowly dying down, but it's nothing like school leaders, people who are in the trenches trying to figure out what to do, which is just, day to day. And one of the things we know from post-emergency rebuilding is if you don't set out a vision of where you want to get to, all the little decisions that you make in the immediate recovery period, and we know this from decades of research in education and emergencies, you will sort of just go back to the way you were. And there'll be a lot of little decisions that will lock you into the old normal, whether it's technology, procurement decisions, where there's scheduling decisions, right? So I think it's really important to give people a vision, even if it's aspirational, and saying like, where could we go? What could it be? How could you engage parents and the new education allies outside of the school system in a new way to really sort of strengthen schooling experience for everybody? What could it look like? What are some ways to lean in? And I think the more this group and everybody who's on the call can articulate that, the more helpful it will be in this sort of period of sort of response and recovery. We're in a little bit, depending on which country you're in, of cyclical response and recovery. Those are my thoughts, for whatever they're worth.
Thank you, Rebecca. I think you articulated a number of really big concepts there, everything from opportunity hoarding to institutional inertia to maybe administrator or school leader controversy, aversion, the importance of context and local culture in terms of how this works. And we could unpack a lot of that, you know, and it would take us hours, and that's all good systems level stuff. So thank you. What I'm struck by is that so far in our first 25 minutes, we've been talking a lot sort of up here, a sort of this upper level of generality. And I think it might be helpful for all of us, particularly our audience, for you to maybe articulate 3 to 5 really concrete things that you saw on the ground in different countries that you think were successful in working, and what did those look like in some concrete language? I'm thinking, for example, about the headline that I saw 2 days ago that the San Diego Unified School District in California here in the States is changing its entire grading system to mitigate equity concerns, right? Particularly during the pandemic, right? And that is a very concrete, specific action that they hope will have an impact on a certain population. So as you all have been doing this work overseas, I guess, you know, it would be helpful for us to get a picture of what some of these countries are doing and what that looks like at the ground level, so we can sort of envision what these larger generalities mean in practice. So maybe y'all can share a few examples for us.
Jenny, you want to
Sure.
take a stab and then
Sure.
I'll add my 2 cents?
Absolutely, absolutely. Scott, I can share a few examples of some of our partners that we're undertaking this action research with, which we refer to as real-time scaling labs. Yeah, I think they speak to a lot of the issues we've been talking about already. You know, Chris, when you were talking about the sort of deficit model, I immediately thought about our partners in Tanzania, where we're partnering with CAMFED, which is an international NGO that's working in 5 sub-Saharan African countries focused on ensuring that girls go to secondary school, stay in secondary school, and leave secondary school with valuable skills that they're able to transition into the workforce and further to higher education, if that be the decision. And one of the really impressive programs that CAMFED has is called the Learner Guide program, where they basically are working with young women who have been supporting, have finished secondary school, and then they volunteer to come back for 18 months to serve as sort of teacher aides. And they come back to secondary school classrooms and they teach a life skills curriculum in these schools where life skills wasn't currently provided. And so what's been really exciting about this is that these are young women themselves who come from marginalized communities, and they really serve as role models to these young women and young men in secondary school. And in return for being learner guides for 18 months, they themselves get further training, entrepreneurship training, business training. They have access to low interest loans, and they also get certification that they can use to either fast track into teaching or for higher education. So fantastic program, has been evaluated, great impact, both on the students themselves as well as on the learner guides. So fast forward to come March and when schools closed, what was really exciting is, I think to your point, Chris, is rather than looking at these young women who they themselves come from marginalized communities and are facing, you know, a number of challenges as well, they quickly mobilized and they were able to continue to provide support to other secondary school students in the communities. So they went on the radio and they were able to continue to deliver some of this critical life skills program, and they adapted quickly to include some of the World Health Organization guidelines and national government guidelines on sanitation and hand washing and so forth. Because they live in the communities where these young girls were, they were able to, you know, at safe distances, reach out and make sure that young girls were able to continue their education when schools were going to reopen, work with the parents and caregivers to ensure that girls were able to go back to school, because we know in many of these contexts, there's incredible risks of once girls, you know, have an interruption in their education, they might not return. So just an example of how, you know, these young sort, you know, teacher aides were really deployed and mobilized in a variety of ways to support other learners in their communities.
And I want to introduce a question from the audience that ties into a question that I wanted to ask. As you know, I think a lot about scale, and there's scaling up within a country, but there's also scaling innovations across countries. And I think that's one of the things we've attempted to do with these initiatives, is to get silver lining for learning, to show people across the world what innovative things are happening in countries that could be adapted perhaps to theirs. So Priyank Sharma asked, is there a framework that allows you to borrow innovative ideas from other geographies, making sure you take care of the contextual nuances, because we all know that not invented here is just a huge problem in education and in general.
No, couldn't agree more with you, Chris and Priyanka. That's a great question, because I think the whole idea here is, and certainly with COVID, if ever there was a time to learn from others and not reinvent the wheel, now is the time. And certainly the idea is, how can we identify what has been effective in one context and not expect that you can just unfurl it and roll it out and replicate it wholesale in other locations? But certainly, are there some core elements about it that can be adapted and brought and contextualized to new locations? And that's very much the type of work and research we're doing. In terms of a framework, perhaps, it's a little subjective because it's one that Rebecca and Eileen and I worked on, but within the Millions Learning Report, there is a framework that we developed specifically for education, because at the time, we didn't find one specific to education. A number of excellent scaling frameworks out there. And in fact, we borrowed heavily, Chris, from the work that you had done as well. But really looking at, in some low and middle income countries, what would be some of the key drivers that one would think about, as you were saying, the enabling environment? How would one design for scale? How does one think about delivering for scale in terms of identifying innovations in one context and adapting and adopting to a new context? So that was a bit of the intention behind that. And maybe just in response to Scott's question, to give a concrete example about what that could look like, another one of our partners is working, actually two partners, one in Cote d'Ivoire in West Africa and one in Botswana. We're basically adapting a remedial education approach known as teaching at the right level, that was originally developed in India by the NGO Pratham, and over 15 plus years has been reaching hundreds of thousands of young children, and has been rigorously evaluated in partnership with JPAL out of MIT. And it's basically an approach that groups children, usually between grades 3, 4, and 5, according to their learning level rather than their grade level, and uses very simple, playful learning, child-centered pedagogy, and along with assessments, ongoing assessments, to see where children are at and continue to adapt and meet them at their level. So this is an approach that pre-COVID was already being adapted to a number of different countries in Africa, and is further being tested and evaluated. In Botswana, it's being adapted by an NGO known as Young Love, and in partnership with the Ministry of Basic Education, it was being implemented in a number of primary schools. When COVID broke out in Botswana, and very quickly Young Love knew schools were going to close as well, they quickly collected as many cell phone numbers of parents and caregivers as they could get. They ended up collecting close to 10,000. At the time, they didn't know exactly what they were going to do with them, but they knew it was going to be important, because they knew that cell phones, at least a number of families had access to, in terms of instead of other technologies. And so what they ended up doing is, they've now been iterating and adapting with, how can we provide some of that remedial catch-up education via very simple SMS text, following up with a phone call. So they would send out a weekly problem set for caregivers, parents, to do with their children. And then they would follow up with an instructor with a 15-minute phone call to talk through on speakerphone those problem sets. And they've gone through some randomized control trials as well on those, and they found some really impressive effects in terms of, I think on average, it's 52% that these SMS followed up by phone calls has been able to reduce in numeracy among children who've been participating in this. And then the other outcome has been that parents are even further aware of what's the learning level of their children. Because I think, I was thinking, Shanye, that's maybe another one of the outcomes and potentials, and how do we get some of these innovations to stick? And I think part of it is just really having this broader tent that Rebecca talked about, of people engaging in children's education, really being aware of where children are at in terms of learning and what additional support that they need. And that's certainly, I think, been one of the outcomes that they've seen in Botswana with engaging parents and caregivers through these SMS remote instructions.
Can I jump in, Chris? Because I want to respond to a question that Scott put up, because I think it's an interesting question, a good one, saying, what's the relevance for the US or more sort of high income, more quote unquote developed countries that, we're giving, Jenny and I just gave some examples that are around fairly basic sort of literacy acquisition, et cetera. And one of the things that I've seen, well, I want to challenge your framing of the question a little bit, Scott, because I'm on the board of a group called Imagine Worldwide, and so have been following quite closely their work. And basically, what they are is sort of a scaling nonprofit that is working. The idea is we're bringing sort of the best ed tech software and together with government scale to try to tackle this problem of basic literacy and numeracy. And they started in Africa. And it's the 1 billion and KitKit software, which you guys might know about because they won the big X Prize a couple of years ago. And the idea is, and very few ed tech interventions do this, you can start with zero literacy. You don't know any, in your language, you don't know any, phonemes or letters or whatever, and you can get to fluency. I don't think we've seen getting to fluency yet, but it's been trialed in the UK, trialed in Malawi, it's at a relative scale, trialed in refugee contexts, and the rigorous evaluations have shown sort of substantial improvement over classroom-based instruction. It's totally personalized, right? That's the revolution. Kids come in, they poke a picture on their little solar powered tablet, and because many of them can't recognize their name, and they do it for 45 minutes a day or something, or not even that. It's much better than sitting in whole class instruction, or teachers who do have the sophistication of doing differentiated instruction, like the type that Jenny was talking about. And what we have seen in COVID is school districts, I think in almost every state in the US, have asked for this, have found out about it, want it, because A, during COVID, it's a great way to do instruction, and B, there's a lot of kids in the US who are behind grade level. Right? And it's a completely different way of thinking about literacy and freeing up. It's sort of a great example in real life of this hypothetical vision that, ed tech could help liberate and free up teacher time to do real human interpersonal stuff. We haven't quite seen it get there in real practice, but it's to me a really good concrete example of this sort of global innovation across boundaries. I have some more examples, but I want to turn over to you, Chris. I can sprinkle them in later.
Yeah, so thank you, Rebecca. I appreciate the pushback. I think the challenge is that, the context, I think in a lot of high income countries feels so different that when we talk about sort of reverse innovation and what lessons can we learn from lower middle income locations, right? That we have sort of this arrogance here in the States and maybe some other places where like, well, most of our kids are beyond basic literacy, so there's nothing we can learn from them, right? And so I appreciate you just talking about that a little bit. And, I think people in the States are all over the place in terms of, where they fall on the continuum around support for personalized or individualized software systems, right? And some people think they're great, and some people are pretty skeptical. And, we have in this past initiatives like Teach to One that haven't seemed to pan out too great. And that might be an interesting discussion for the host to have sometime. But I think, just sort of cracking the hubris of the developed world and really saying, there's some strategies and some techniques that we can learn from other places. We don't have all the answers. And so I just appreciate you articulating that for us. Thank you.
And if I could just quickly add there, I mean, it's funny, I gave the Botswana example, and I live in Connecticut, in a district where when the school shut down, all the children were handed Chromebooks, right? So I couldn't be talking about, very different environments. And yet I'm constantly thinking about and reminded about how much we're borrowing in some ways from these countries right now in terms of the learning. So for example, we're on a double shift system right now, and really thinking about what does it mean for some students to go in the morning, some students to go in the afternoon. How do you utilize the same space? How do you think about learning continuity outside of the classroom? You know, thinking about working parents and how are they providing ongoing support, and recognizing, you know, it's eye-opening for me to see what my children are struggling with and not struggling with, much I wasn't aware of before, you know, working full-time and having my children in school full-time. And then the third part is, you know, really it talked about this, you know, pedagogical approach of teaching at the right level, and at its simplicity, you know, grouping small groups of children together and having them learn what the level they're at. And that's what our schools are really relying on. A lot of this sort of the children coming together, facilitating some teaching and learning interaction, and really trying to do so, you know, in as much of a sort of playful way as possible in light of all the social distancing that's happening. So it's just that I'm constantly struck by how much we're actually borrowing from these contexts, if not the technology. You know, it's not the SMS, the text I was talking about, but certainly sort of the underlying approaches in many ways.
It gets back to a theme that we've been sort of dancing around the whole discussion, which is the class difference between what people who are privileged within the system are willing to accept in terms of educational innovation, and what opportunities they hoard, and what people in marginalized populations are desiring in educational innovation because they know the current system isn't working well for them, and what opportunities they seek. Because the interesting side of opportunity hoarding is that now people are hoarding the wrong opportunities. The privileged are actually preparing their children to lose to artificial intelligence systems, and to be ignorant about the very cultural you know, nuances that are going to be most important in a global civilization. And a lot of the developing world, the global South countries, really gets it. And what they don't want is to be locked into the remediation cycle that has been so lethal within the developed world. So there's an interesting dialogue there that's actually, unfortunately, quite different than the dialogues that typically happen when global North and global South countries get together and they start talking about innovation.
I think even I've been duly chastised over the course of my career for the term reverse innovations. Because of course, which you just use and we all use, right, Scott? I mean, it's a term of art we all use. But if you're sitting in South Africa or New Zealand or whatever, and you're talking about reverse innovation, they're like, what are you, the holder of innovation? And you know, it all flows one way, and now so I do think just the mental frame of good ideas can come from anywhere. And the key issue is, are they going to help solve my problem in my context, and how do I contextualize them, scale them, and keep and sustain them, is, I think, a useful frame. And I would say that one of the, you know, I think, Chris, you bring up a really good point, and I will be quite honest that I have a very sort of big bias or blind spot, in that I'm really quite focused on education inequality. So, you know, my head is really for the kids who don't, like my kids. My kids have little AR VR glasses, and they, you know, they can put it in they can watch all sorts of cool stuff, and do some experiential stuff with Nat Geo, and, you know, explore the great stingrays of the South Pacific. Like, they are having a great time. They don't really want to go back to school. They are doing all sorts of good stuff. And I don't spend my work hours worried about them or kids like them. So I do have maybe a partial view in terms of the solutions that I'm thinking about. So So that's just to say, Chris, I haven't really thought actually about the problems you articulated of sort of the people with means getting into pods and maybe doing the wrong thing. But some of the thing that gives me hope, and one of the things that I think has potential to be very transformative is the nature of this family school partnership, teacher parent relationship. I think that may be equal to, or possibly, dare I say, especially in this group, even more than the ed tech sort of insertion, might be one, if we look back in 10 years, might be one of the bigger transformative sort of sea changes. Now, it could fizzle and die like everything, which is Sunyi's point, but we have this big study on family engagement and education going on at we started it before COVID, thinking that, you know, sort of the demand side for the purpose of a system and community support for that is really important for sustaining innovation and enabling environment. And then COVID hit and it was sort of at the center. So one of the things we've learned, we've done a survey, we're in the midst still, but several countries, we have I think 14,000 responded so far. And the thing that parents like the most, at least what they are ready for, what they like the most in terms of the teaching and learning approaches that have been happening, are the social ones. They love, equal to live synchronous discussions with teachers, whether that's FaceTime or in a market square or Zoom or whatever. The second thing equally they love the most is discussion with their families and relatives, like as a learning mechanism. And to me, that's a huge opportunity to think about how do you really introduce the family as a learning ally and really leverage it, and not, hey mom, we know parent engagement is really, really helpful for kids. It helps all kids, but especially the most marginalized kids sort of do achieve on basic metrics, attendance, completion, you know, grade level achievement scores. But could we think of it as really, you know, opening a new way for conceiving the educational experience, right? A lot more application, a lot more discourse, a lot more thinking through, a lot more sort of get perspective taking at the home and reflecting back with the teacher. You know, that it seems like there's a great thirst for it. And I am seeing pockets of that emerge as concrete examples. There's great examples of again, really light, not a lot of heavy website stuff. Parents don't have time for that, like logging on, special passwords, but SMSs, you know, something on counting and climate, you know, how many buckets of water or cups of water do you think your family uses each day? That's a great example that we've seen. And then the kid goes around and like has to measure, and how long is a shower, and, you know, how's mom and dad cooking? So there's lots of examples like that. And then what does that mean for climate, et cetera? You could imagine many, and I'm hearing from at least the jurisdictions that we're working with that that's something that they want to keep up and exploit more. So anyways, that's one thought.
Well, I'm going to jump in here and say thank you for Scott for asking the question about an example or a story, because I was going to ask that. And thank you, Jenny, for your answer to that question, as well as Rebecca. I also want to give a recommendation to Jenny. When you mention the learning level, not the grade level, that might make for a real ideal piece for Xiangye's journal, ECNU Review of Education. You might talk about doing things by learning level and not grade level. It might be in the title of that. So it's something that caught my attention as a former educational psychologist and neo-Vygotskian. I thought I want to know more. I want to read that when you write that. Please send me a copy. I'll give you some feedback when you draft it. But thirdly, when I was preparing for this session, what struck me across the papers that you've written is that we've been inviting various guests from the Global South the past month or so, And before that, we had the Commonwealth of Learning early on, maybe our second or third session from Vancouver, talking about what they're doing with all former British colonies around the world, teacher training with open educational resources. I don't know if you heard of the Commonwealth of Learning. We had Contact North in Canada and Ontario talking about what they're doing to the far reaches of the provinces there and beyond into the world community now. And 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, we had the Open U and cyber universities from Indonesia, from Malaysia, from Thailand and the Philippines, the directors and the chancellors. And just last week, we had the World Bank representative in Sheila Jagannathan talking about what's happening and what they've been able to do during COVID, pre-COVID, and future. So my question for you is, your time is probably sucked up all week long, and you probably need as much sleep as you can get. But if Jenny and Rebecca woke up on a Saturday morning and invited a couple of colleagues to join you for breakfast, and your theme of that breakfast was, who could we get to do a symposium with us? Who's doing scaling kinds of things like we are that we could present at a conference and get people really excited, or maybe edit a book or something else, or partner with? Who are other people or other entities, other organizations that you're connected to or reading about and you're excited about? Who has you getting excited, or who have you already contacted? Tell us, if what would you do on a Saturday breakfast?
Jenny, you want to tackle the scaling community question?
Sure, sure.
She happens to be facilitating a community of practice of scaling experts. So that's the perfect question for her.
Yeah, I mean, and I realized, Kurt, I never responded to your initial question about the Learning Network. So I actually feel incredibly blessed because in some ways my day-to-day job is sort of doing what you described. So because I have the privilege to sort of facilitate this learning network of folks who are, just doing yeoman's work around the world to ensure that children receive a quality education, broad breadth of skills. And I get the privilege of sort of learning alongside them. So, the colleagues I mentioned in Botswana, the Ministry of Basic Education, with Young Love, and Young Love is so dynamic. I mean, Kurt, I'd love to work with Sean Ye and some of them on writing this article, because the first time I met them, I had to go back and write with them a blog called "How Does One Scale Spirit?" Like, how does one scale energy, right? It's so amorphous. It's not a sort of cookie cutter recipe. And that's what I saw, being able to see the work that they were doing with children in these schools. I mentioned this group in Tanzania and these young women. I mean, they are powerful, right? They come from marginalized communities. Nobody necessarily thought they would be able to go to secondary school, much less graduate from secondary school, much less be leaders in their communities. And so to be able to sit with them, is an honor. And so they would be part of my Saturday morning breakfast. And then certainly, I didn't mention our partners in Jordan who are working to try to ensure that young people become financially literate in a region where youth unemployment is huge and financial literacy is a piece of that. And so really working tirelessly, and now with COVID, to say, okay, we thought about putting financial literacy online. Now we got to fast forward and do that and figure out how. And so they have been working around the clock doing videos and making sure this curriculum now is digital. And really the list could go on and on, and in Cote d'Ivoire, as I mentioned, they're busy ensuring that the early grade learning work that they're doing now is on radio. In the Middle East, Sesame Workshop is working with the International Rescue Committee to make sure that young children have access to early learning opportunities. So really, I could put together a list, but I would say that I have the pleasure that it's sort of my day-to-day job. And the last thing I'll say is the learning community piece is critical, because we're all guilty of it, right? We all work in silos, we live in silos, and we reinvent the wheel way too much. So to have the opportunity, and that's something we've sort of deliberately tried to build between these real-time scaling labs, to learn and share has been tremendous. And we found during COVID, it's been incredibly powerful and important. As one country is saying, we're experimenting with radio, and another one saying we're experimenting with telephone, and another country saying we don't even have that sort of low tech, we're thinking about other mechanisms. They're really able to share those experiences. So I would just double down on the learning community piece that you mentioned.
Is any of that written up anywhere that I could, access? and find?
Absolutely. I will send you a list after this. I'd be delighted to.
And
Great.
I want to add just my 2 cents of groups that I look to, and they're close peers. We do a lot of collaboration on sort of inspiration of sort of spotlighting and highlighting in education innovations around the world, with this often with this lens towards, future ready learning experiences that can bring kids the set of, the broad suite of competencies they really need to thrive. SUMA is a great organization, innovation hub out of focused on Latin America. They're doing really, really cool work. 100, which I'm sure you've heard of, out of Finland, does a lot of spotlighting and is very into sort of communications, sort of the idea that we need, and a lot of teacher level innovation that they sort of surface and network. I really like in the US Remake Learning, the Grable Foundation sort of seeding of sort of a network and ecosystem of community level, really grounded, in school districts, nonprofits, businesses, libraries, community centers, all focused and networked together, doing different events and ideas around sort of future ready learning experiences for kids in the Western Pennsylvania area. So those are some of the groups that I just think are doing great work.
This is really helpful. And as we'll have to start thinking about wrapping up, but as I reflect on the time that we've spent together and the themes in the conversation, a lot of it has been about bottom up in terms of marginalized populations with powerful ideas, bottom up in terms of parents and communities finally having a voice in what kind of education their kids receive and becoming partners in the educational process. And when I think about innovation in medicine and public health, there was a lot of top-down innovation in terms of medical research, improving medical practice, but the bottom-up innovation in terms of wellness rather than illness was what really changed the entire setting. And I guess, the question that we're all asking ourselves is, how do we light that fire in education? How do we get parents and groups that have historically been left out of the educational conversation so excited that they're pounding the table and coming forward with ideas about how we can make this whole global educational system work? Because you're right that otherwise it's going to wash away. And China, I think, is largely because of the Gaokao, would be my guess as to why China is going back. And the high stakes tests in the U.S. have been hard hit, but I can imagine a couple of years from now we'll be looking back and saying, "Oh, we missed the window. Somehow everybody went back to the high stakes tests, and here we are back with the industrial era educational system." So I just want to thank the two of you. I know how busy you are. All of us are grateful that you made the time during the weekend to come and share these ideas. And I think our hope is that the interconnections that you listed, we just all need to keep interconnecting and sharing ideas and working together and pushing forward, and together, hopefully, we can find a way to pull all of that off. So part of my responsibility is to tell you what's happening next week. Next week is our periodic reflection of the co-hosts. So all of us can ruminate together and ruminate in response to questions from you, the online participants. And then we have an exciting series of episodes planned for the end of October and right on into November and December. So things continue to be really interesting in terms of what's happening in education. And just to close with where we began, if we can't make this opportunity to work, it's a once in a lifetime opportunity to really make a big change. And hopefully we'll all be able to do that. Anybody else wanted to add a last minute thought?
I'll point out that we're going to have penguin researchers, two different people who've researched in Antarctica, one a penguin researcher, one studying the krill and the Antarctic toothfish. And we'll also have people looking at kids doing climate change research in MOOCs for a cause all around the world. So a couple of interesting things over the next couple of months. I'm lining up different things, and there's various things coming up. Anyone else?
No, we'll be